Hello. The topic that we're going to be taking a look at today is the topic of rational choice theory. I think that a philosopher probably came up with the title rational choice theory, the name anyway, because philosophers are really good at naming things. Rational choice theory is, if you think about it, makes sense. It's a theory about how to make rational choices, right? So this will come in handy in most of the rest of the unit, and so we're going to take a look at some sort of basics. This is a very basic crash course in what's known as rational choice theory. So the way to start this out, in order to tell you about the rest of rational choice theory, I have to tell you about one particular kind of thing. I have to ask you a very important question. And the question starts with, which do you prefer? You say, okay, well, which what? Okay, well, here's the question. Do you prefer music or cheese? Okay, think very carefully before you just blurt something out, right, that you'll regret. Uh, these are both very valuable things, right? I mean, music is timeless. It's part of what makes us human. And try and survive really, any great amount of time, without some form of music. Same can be said for cheese, right? Cheese is, again, it's been with us a good long time. It's a kind of art form. It's a tough call, I think, really. But of course, you just want to say, well, okay, how am I supposed to answer this question? I like both of these things, or you actually might only like one of these things, in which case, what's wrong with you? But in all seriousness, they say, well, can't you just eat cheese while listening to music, right? I mean, these are things that are hard to compare. I mean, people say that apples and oranges are hard to compare. I don't think they're that hard to compare. In this case, I think music and cheese is pretty hard to compare. But just imagine that the choice really is exclusive, right? You can have only music or only cheese for some limited period of time. Which of these things do you choose? Or somebody offers you, look, I'll give you some music for free, or I'll give you some cheese for free, right? And again, assume it's a kind of cheese you like a nice like nutty Emmentaler, perhaps a nice smoked Gouda. If you're really into this, the sort of smells like feet cheeses, maybe some Stilton or some Maytag, a good old feta, it's a decent choice, right? Anything but cheddar, right? Not that there's anything wrong with cheddar, it's just not very adventurous, okay? So in any case, right, and again, assume it's music you like. Assume maybe it's reggaeton if you're into that sort of thing, or, calypso, or, God forbid, jazz, right? So any of these things, right, just assume it's something you like. So it's a music you like versus a cheese you like, and the point is, we have to sort of force ourselves into quantifying this in some way. And so one way to quantify this is just to give each of them a kind of score that reflects your actual preferences. So again, think of it as maybe half an hour of your favorite music versus 1 ounce of your favorite cheese. Okay, and somebody's going to give you one of those two things for free, right? So that's the idea is that what are you going to pick, and what's your preference? And again, think how strong is your preference as well. So one way to answer might be to say, well, look, I prefer the music very much over the cheese. Cheese is okay. I don't really like it that well. But the music, I'm really into that. So I like the music. If you're going to give this score, you're going to be saying that you like the music 10 times as much as you like the cheese that's on offer, right? That's what those points mean. They don't really mean anything. They're not units of anything, right? They're not units of it's like, oh, 10 hedons of pleasure I get from the music, and 1 hedon of pleasure I get from the no, right? It's just there to show the relative strength of somebody's preference. Right. So another way that somebody might answer, they might prefer the cheese to the music, but not quite by so much. They might say, yes, I do prefer the cheese to the music, but by a substantial margin, but not not really huge. I like the cheese about 3 times as much as I like the music. Right. Again, then you'd assign them scores like this. Perhaps if it was a much closer call, you would say, oh, I prefer the cheese, by by just a little over the music, right? 10-9. I'll give cheese a score of 10, music a score of 9. That would be a fairly close call. Now, what if it's even closer than that? What if you're like, well, gosh, it's not quite, I don't like the cheese 10% more than I like the music, but I do like the cheese just a little bit more. Well, maybe you'll assign it a score like this. This 199. Now it's even closer. And again, you've multiplied your cheese score by 10 from the last one, but again, that doesn't matter. These aren't units of anything. It's just if somebody gave you these numbers, you could tell what their relative preferences really were, that they preferred the cheese to the music by a tiny little bit. But what if it's even more of a tiny little bit? You could even do that, okay? That's a tiny, 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 tiny preference in favor of the cheese. In fact, if you really just couldn't decide and resorted to flipping a coin or something, you would just give them the same number. Give them both a score of 1, right? Or both a score of 1,000,000. It doesn't matter, okay? The idea is that these numbers are supposed to be compared with each other to sort of weigh how much you prefer one thing to the other. Okay, so you with me so far? Right. If not, rewind and go through this whole thing again until you say, yes, I'm with you. Then you can just go ahead and continue in this lecture. Because I told you that story to tell you this one. So you have to get comfortable with the idea of quantifying, of assigning numbers to your preferences, whatever your preferences in fact are, because a rational person we're going to define as somebody who takes the most reasonable means to satisfy their own preferences, right? That sounds like a very ordinary definition of rationality, and that's the version of rationality we're going to be taking a look at, right? So consider a hypothetical case in which you have, in this case, you have 3 possible options. And we're going to call those options option A, option B, and option C, because we're being creative. Now, I mean, they could be anything, right? You could say, well, these are 3 things I could do on a Saturday night, right? I could stay home and read a book. I could go to a movie, or at least you could have, in the recent past and probably hopefully in the not too distant future. You could go to a party, again, hopefully not too far in the distant future. Maybe you're at, you're surfing around on Netflix and you think of 3 different programs that you might think of watching, right? A, B, or C, okay? Perhaps, A, B, or C are varieties of ranch dressing that you're trying to choose between at the grocery store, because God knows there's 1,000 of those for some reason. And so anyway, again, you just, you got 3 options, right? You could have more options, but we're just going to say 3 for the sake of having an example. Now, after you pick your options, certain things will happen that are outside of your control that will affect how well you enjoy the option that you chose, right? Because of course we don't choose everything in life. We choose what we do, but we don't necessarily choose what happens after we do. Not all the time anyway. So again, imagine you have 3 different varieties of ranch dressing that you're choosing from. One of the things you don't control is how they actually taste, how much you'll enjoy them, right? Certain things can happen that can also affect your enjoyment. I guess a better example would be, again, imagine the 3 things to do on a Saturday night. Imagine you decided to stay home and read a book. Well, I mean, one of the things that you don't control is whether the book is going to be any good, right? If you haven't read it before, then you don't know. So that's one of the reasons, that's one of the great reasons to read a book, is to see if it's any good. If you decide to go to a party, you may not know how many of your friends will show up, right? Or if the music will be lame or something like that. So those are all different outcomes. Those are things that could happen. And so what we're going to do is we're going to again, for the sake of having an example, we're going to have 4 outcomes. Again, you can have more, you can have fewer, but for the sake of our example, we're gonna talk about 4. Maybe the idea is that you go to a party and in outcome 1, only 1 of your friends shows up, and in outcome 2, 2 of your friends show up, etc. Right? Whatever. You can make up any story you like, and so essentially what we're going to do, we're actually going to start making up stories about this. So imagine, right, that option A and B and C are all, say, job offers, right? Maybe you have you've applied a bunch of places and you've gone through the interview process, and Lord knows that's a stressful process, but finally everything's paid off, and then three places have offered you a job with them, right? And they're very different kinds of places. Let's say that A is one kind of a place, B is another place, and C is another. So you have 3 choices. You want to take one of these jobs, but you're trying to decide which. Now, of course, one of the things that can happen after you take a job that's out of your control is what the economy does, and maybe that affects how well you'll enjoy which job you pick, right? So again, we're making this up as we go along. We're just got to tell some kind of a story to give this example some kind of meaning, because really I'm just going to fill in a bunch of numbers. So The idea is that, say maybe in outcome one, the economy just tanks, just, goes very, very badly, which is totally imaginable. In outcome two, maybe the economy is just a little bit bad. Not way bad, but just a little bad, right? And in outcome three, the economy is sort of good, kind of normal good, not really, really good, but good, right? And number four, it's bonanza, right? It's a bonkers great economy, okay? So the idea is that each of those different outcomes might affect how well you enjoy which job, either job A, job B, or job C. But you've got to still pick one of them on that basis. And so you try and anticipate all these things. And then what you're going to do is you're going to assign a number to each of those little boxes, right? Because we've made a table here. Anytime you can make a table, you should, right? And so in that sort of A1 area, we're going to say, we're going to put a number, and that number, I'm going to fill them in, but just assume that that number fits your actual preferences. And if the story I'm telling doesn't fit with your actual preferences, feel free to tell a different one that does have these numbers fit your actual preferences. It really doesn't matter. It's just a hypothetical. So let's say that job A is a job at like as a Wall Street stock analyst or stockbroker, something like that, right? It's a real high pressure job. There's like all kinds of well, people in suits yelling at each other. I guess if you've seen the movie Wall Street, right? That's you see the movie poster for that here with Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen. I actually forgot that Daryl Hannah was in that until I found this image. It's been a long, long time. I haven't, but it's got such a cheery tagline, such as "Every dream has a price," right? I mean, it's a very uplifting film. And it portrays a stock, like the Wall Street life as a really great life to live. It's mostly just, like, so again, picture lots of people in suits yelling at each other. Okay. So let's say that you choose option A. If you choose option A and the economy just tanks, then everybody is totally panicking. Everyone's worried about their jobs, everyone's worried about their money, everyone's worried about everything. It's people yelling at each other, terrible environment. We're going to call that one a one. We're going to put a one in that box there. And again, assume that that fits your actual preferences. And if you have to tell a different story to make that happen, feel free. But that's the idea. And in outcome two, where the economy is just normal bad, like not way bad, but just, it's bad in a way that you see from time to time. Let's say that in that outcome, again, what happens is that people on Wall Street are sort of, very competitive with each other, and they're trying to scrap for that, fraction of a percent of performance that's going to differentiate them from the other people, both at their own company and at rival companies. And it's, very cutthroat and lots of people in suits yelling at each other. Let's call that a one. So we're going to call that one a 1, 2. And outcome 3, we're talking just a pretty normal economy, good, but not great. Most years, that's what the economy's like. And so in that situation, what people are doing on Wall Street is they're really competitive with each other. They're sort of scrapping for that fraction of 1% of performance that differentiates them from, other people at their company and other companies. And so let's call that a 1 as well. And so finally, let's get to outcome 4, which is where the economy just goes bonkers good, right? And then it's Rolexes and Porsches for everybody. It's the life of life of class, right? The big old I don't know. Imagine that however you want, right? You got your Armani suit, that you were able to pay cash for, whatever. I don't know. Whatever that is, let's call it. Let's say it's good. Let's call that 17. So there we go. That's job A, and that's again, pretend that those are your actual preferences. You prefer the thing that happens in number 4 17 times more than you prefer anything that happens in outcome 3 or 2 or 1. Okay. All right, so now it's time to talk about option B, right? This different job. So maybe it's a job in sales, right? And sales is what it is, but in a really bad economy, perhaps sales isn't all that fun. You've got a lot of competition. Everyone's chasing after not that much money. People tend to feel hassled because times are bad. And so again, maybe sales isn't really very fun, but it's maybe still a little bit better than Wall Street will say. In fact, maybe it's a little bit like the movie Glengarry Glen Ross, with Al Pacino and Jack Lemmon and Alec Baldwin and Ed Harris and Alan Arkin, I think, was in that. Kevin Spacey was in there. What's funny is you see sort of Alec Baldwin kind of front and center on that cover, even though he's really only in the film, as far as I remember, for like 10 minutes, maybe less. He just does kind of like one scene, if I remember right. Maybe again, it's been a long time since I've seen this one. Maybe I should update some of the examples I have for these things. Oh well, maybe you should watch older movies, right? How we'll do it that way. Okay, so actually, Jack Lemmon does a fantastic job here in this one. He really is the main character here, and again, real star-studded cast with a lot of stuff there. But really, lots of people in suits yelling at each other. So let's say again, economy's bad, sales isn't very fun, but it's still maybe better than being on Wall Street. Let's call that a 4. Okay. Say the economy is a little better, sales is a little better, but not a lot better. Let's call that let's call it a 5. That's outcome number 2. And when the economy is normal, sales takes a bit of a jump up. It's a little better still. Okay. So let's call that a 6. And in outcome 4, when the economy is really great, sales is better. It's much easier. Times are good, but it's, not quite Rolexes and Porsches for everybody. So that's going to be a 7. And so there we go. We have the whole of option B. Right, and so that's the way that one is. And again, you could tell any story you want as long as those are the numbers you get out of it. We'll talk about these numbers in a minute and how they compare with each other. But now let's talk about option C. That is this third possible job that you are offered. Let's say that this one is just government work. Okay, you work in an office, you do a job, you come in at 9, you leave at 5. It's very standard. And you've got sort of a very regular schedule of pay raises on a schedule, and things are very standard, right? Things move along at their own pace, and the economy doesn't really matter so much. In fact, here's the thing: they don't make a lot of movies about government workers. Now, they make lots of movies about like spies and soldiers and politicians and stuff like that. There are lots of those sort of movies. But in terms of like your sort of ordinary rank and file government worker, I had a hard time thinking of certainly very many. And in fact, the only one that came to mind wasn't even set in the United States. It's a movie called The Lives of Others. It's set in Germany, half of Germany anyway, before it became all unified. It was back in East Germany, communist East Germany, and the sort of protagonist is a guy whose job it is to basically listen in on people, right, for the government, right? They did that. It was a sort of surveillance state, had secret police, all that business, and it's actually a really fantastic movie. It's again very serious in its tone, but I'd recommend it to anybody. It's a really, really outstanding film. Actually, much more recent than the last two I mentioned. But still not brand new. In any case, government work not affected at all by the state of the economy, one way or the other. So let's just say 5s all the way across the board, right? So, that's the way it is. So here we go. Now we have our sets of numbers. Now we have a very interesting question. What do we do? Which of these options is the best option? Now, I think you can see when you look at these options that there's something to like about all of them, right? And I think sometimes maybe you have to think carefully to really see what there is to like about each of these numbers. But, we'll talk about some of these rules as we go. The rules of rational choice theory, as in the rules of how to be a rational agent in cases like this, are as follows. Okay, rule number 1 is to always choose the dominant option. That's always rule number 1. That's always the first rule you follow if it's available, right? Now, there isn't always a dominant option available, but if there is, you would be irrational not to take it. And so this is the first rule to check for. Now, the dominant option is defined as one that is as good or better than every other option in every outcome. Okay. So think about that for a second. Let's take a look at the table as we have it. You might say, well, isn't that option A? Isn't option A the best one? Well, again, only if outcome 4 happens. Because here's the thing, if you choose A, you could get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Any of those things can happen. It's not in your control. Certainly this 17 here is the largest one on the board, as it were. But that doesn't, but it's option A is worse on in outcome 3 and outcome 2 and outcome 1. Option B is worse than option C in outcome 1, just the same in outcome B, and it's the best in outcome 3, but it's only the second best in outcome 4. And then of course C is actually the best in 1, tied for the best in 2, and it's it's second place in 3, and also but it comes in last place in outcome 4. So you'll see that there isn't a single option that does better than everything else every time. Imagine we had some fictional option D. Look at D here. We see that D is the best in outcome 1, the best in outcome 2, tied for the best in outcome 3, and is also the best in outcome 4. If you're looking at these options here, you'd obviously have to be irrational not to pick D, right? And that's the whole purpose of the rule of this dominance option, right? Is that if it's dominant, it's the rational choice. All right. Well, so I've set these numbers up so that there just isn't a dominant choice. So we have to move on and look at other options. So another option that we might like is the option of maximizing expected utility. Okay, and to maximize expected utility, we choose the option that has the greatest weighted average. Now I say weighted average because this gets a little complicated, and I'm not going to really dwell on it. So for our purposes, we're just assuming that our outcomes 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all equally likely. Okay, if we, for example, thought that maybe 3 was much more likely than 1, 2, or 4, or that 2 and 3 were much more likely and 1 and 4 much less likely, we could put a multiplier on those things to make the outcomes in 2 and 3 more important than there's way more. So if you're curious about this, just Google how to calculate a weighted average, and you'll get mounds and mounds of help on that. But the idea is here, we're just going to assume that outcomes 1, 2, 3, and 4 are equally likely. And so in this case, we're just going to choose whatever option has the highest simple average. So if you've sort of calculated this already, kudos to you. Okay, you're paying attention to something that turns out is going to matter. So if you look at the average of options A, B, and C, you notice that option A and option C, actually option C is about the easiest possible average to calculate, but they're the same, right? They have a total of 20, you divide by 4, you're going to get 5. B has the highest average of all of these things. And so if we're going to be maximizing our expected utility, then B is our option, right? It has the highest average. So if we play this game 100 times and we choose B every time, we're likely in the long run to do better than if we had chosen A or C, again, if things get sort of randomized. Right, so maximizing expected utility is a thing to like. And I'm going to apologize a little bit for the term maximize expected utility, because it's not very transparent. It's not very obvious from the term exactly what that is, and that's because it's a term used primarily by economists, right? And economists just aren't as good at naming things as philosophers are, and I'll be apologizing for the economists here in a second as well. So the third rule of a rational choice theory is that you might use something like the Maximian Rule. Now, what I'm going to do here for a second, I'm going to change the story a bit. Okay, or I'm going to add something to the story. Just imagine that you know that you have a personality such that if you picked option A or B or C, whatever those options are, that say that you just knew that anything below a 5, right? The closer it gets to 1, but you're really below a 5, there's a certain threshold where you feel like you just wouldn't feel like life was worth living at that point, right? Well, now which option do you pick? I know it's a very stark example, but now which option do you pick? I think if you're not saying, well, obviously you pick option C under those circumstances, then you haven't quite thought it through, right? You don't want to run the risk of getting anything lower than a certain threshold if there's going to be a disaster, right? And so what we're describing here is a situation in which there's a lot of risk, like the risk is really significant, right? The risk is that of living a life that's not worth living. That's a huge risk, okay? And so you want to try and avoid that. So one thing you can do, if your situation involves a high degree of risk, you can do it. You could play it safe and choose what's called the Maximian Rule. And again, I'm really sorry about this. It's the economists that come up with this crap. Okay, so the word Maximin is a portmanteau of the word maximum and minimum, or rather maximize and minimum, and that's it. I don't know, I think it's dumb, but that's the name of the rule. And so think of maximin as maximize the minimum. Okay, too many M's in there, and again, I'm sorry. The idea is that the Maximian Rule is where you choose the option with the greatest minimum. And again, the appropriate time to use that rule is if you're in a situation where the risk is very significant. So if you're choosing the option with the highest minimum, take a look at our table here. Which option is that? All right. If you said C, you are correct. C has the highest minimum. The least you can get by choosing C is 5. Okay. The least you could choose by getting B is actually 4, which is lower than 5. And the least you could get from choosing A is 1, right, which is also lower than 5. So C has the highest minimum, and so if you want to maximize your minimum, you would choose option C. That's following the Maximian Rule. This is one actually that you need to mark and remember because you will see it again. In fact, for this particular course, almost the entire point of doing this whole rational choice theory thing is to end up talking about this Maximian Rule, and you'll see it again in future readings. The last of these rules is what we call the MaxiMax Rule. Okay, and that's where you again. I'm sorry about the name. This is a portmanteau between the word maximize and the word maximum. And so yes, right. So it's to maximize the maximum, hence MaxiMax Rule. That's where you choose the option with the greatest maximum. And this is the rule you want to use when risk is insignificant. So again, let's tell another different story about our table over here. Imagine you're on a game show, right? And you have like 3 different options, maybe 3 different doors to open. And behind the doors, they tell you what's likely there. And behind A, you've got, a rubber chicken or some other thing that's basically valueless, but then it's at least a fun story. And then of course also some small chance of like maybe 1 in 4 chance, right, of a new car, right? And that's that's your big your big 17, your big jackpot here. Okay. Other prizes you like less well, but you like them better, of course, than the rubber chicken, and of course those are more likely in other doors. And C is like a thing you could just take the guarantee, right? And so if you're on a game show or something like that, if you've ever seen a game show, you know that this is a case where there's really not any risk. Okay. Certainly, people want to try and win the best prize that they can, and it can occasionally be foolish, to go for, tiny little chances if you have a better chance of something that's still pretty good, and that's really the idea. You want to put people in these situations and then, sort of enjoy watching them in those situations. But if you go on The Price is Right and you guess wrong on the showcase item, Bob Barker does not come to your house and take your stuff. Okay, like you keep all the stuff you already had. It's just you don't win that thing. All right, so no, it's not really a problem, right? In fact, there's Bob Barker, right? Bob Barker, by the way, is actually still alive. So yeah. So anyway, if you're using if you're using the MaxiMax rule, you're probably in a situation where the risk is really insignificant. You have, in some sense, nothing or not much to lose, and so it might be rational under those circumstances to just go ahead and go for the jackpot. If you fail, well, you at least have an interesting story. You didn't lose anything, right? And so that might be a good reason to choose something like option A, right? Option A has going for it that it does have the highest outcome on the board, that 17 that's over there in outcome 4, right? So, again, you might go for the jackpot if the risk isn't really all that significant. You might have a strong preference of a car over a rubber chicken. Who wouldn't? But yeah, that's the idea, right? Well, anyway, true story about Bob Barker, actually. He my he was doing The Price is Right for a long time, because my grandmother tells this story of when she was much younger, where her mother, my great grandmother, who is now deceased, she's been deceased for some number of years now, she was actually functionally crazy her entire life. So it's, was it 1/8 of my genes come from that? But yeah, she was nuts, functionally nuts. Like, you didn't have to like put her away in an asylum or anything like that, but she was nuts. And one of the sort of nuts things that she thought for, pretty much her whole life was that the people in the TV could like see you and hear you. And so if my grandmother would like go through the room in her nightgown or something, she'd, say, Marion, they can see you, right? But this connects with Bob Barker because apparently, again, my great grandmother used to watch Bob Barker on television and really liked Bob Barker. She would actually put on her, like all her makeup and do her hair up and put on her nice dress to watch The Price is Right. Again, because she thought that Bob could see her. So nutty as a fruitcake. But yes, there we go. So that's rational choice theory. And rational choice theory will become important in upcoming topics because it's going to matter, right, what a rational person would do. And we're going to define rational by follows the rules of rational choice theory. That is, does the thing that would actually help them get their own preferences. Right. That's what we're going to mean by rational, and we're going to be using some of this terminology in topics in the future. And so make sure to be very familiar with it, and well, then we can move on to sort of bigger and better things and theories of distributive justice.